Hello everyone and welcome to our module on reproductive hormones. There are two classes of reproductive hormones. There are the estrogens, which are the female hormones, and the androgens, which are the male hormones. And these are important for development and function of the sex organs like the ovaries and the testes. They're also important at puberty for development of the secondary sexual characteristics. Shown on the screen are the chemical structures of the three important estrogens. At the top of the screen is the structure of estradiol, which is also sometimes called 17-beta estradiol. It's called a diol because it has two hydroxyl groups. One of the hydroxyl groups is attached to the 17 carbon right here, hence the name 17-beta estradiol. Estrone has a ketone group where estradiol has a hydroxyl group and estriol has three hydroxyl groups. And the potency is such that estradiol is the most potent estrogen, estrone is in the middle, and estriol is the weakest of the three estrogens. Shown on this slide are the chemical structures of the four important androgens. At the top of the screen is the structure of testosterone, which is one of the most abundant androgens, and it's what most people think of when they think of a male hormone. At the bottom of the screen is the structure of dihydrotestosterone, or DHT. I've also shown the structure of androstenedione and DHEA, which is dihydroepiandrosterone. At the top right of the screen, I've listed the potency. DHT is the most potent of the androgens. We will discuss this in more detail in the module on male reproductive hormones, but DHT is not generally synthesized by the testes. Testosterone is made by the testes, and in the periphery it is converted to the more potent DHT. Testosterone is less potent than DHT, and then androstenedione and DHEA are the weakest of the androgens. As you can see from the chemical structures on the last two slides, all of the reproductive hormones are steroid hormones. They are all synthesized from molecules of cholesterol. They have a chemical structure that is very similar to cholesterol. This means they are poorly soluble in plasma. They are made up mostly of carbons and hydrogens, and structures like that are poorly soluble in plasma. For this reason, they need help to be transported through the body, and they get that help from the sex hormone binding globulins, or the SHBGs. A smaller amount is carried by albumin, but most of the reproductive hormones are carried by the SHBGs. When they reach their target organs, they cross the lipid bilayer of cells easily because they are lipid soluble, and they bind to intracellular receptors to exert their effects. Let's talk in more detail about the sex hormone binding globulins. These are glycoproteins that are produced in the liver, and they bind both androgens and estrogens, but it's very high yield to remember that they bind androgens more than estrogens, and I've shown this at the bottom side of the screen here with the A that is much bigger than the E. The fact that sex hormone binding globulins bind androgens more than estrogens has an important clinical consequence called estrogen amplification. It is the free hormones, not the hormones bound to sex hormone binding globulin, that exert the clinical effects. When you increase the amount of sex hormone binding globulins in the plasma, this will lower the amount of free androgens and estrogens. However, it will have more effect on androgens because sex hormone binding globulins preferentially bind androgens. This will increase the ratio of free estrogens to androgens and thus amplify the estrogen effects. To make this more clear, let's look at this illustration I've made at the bottom of the screen. Imagine in a situation shown on the left, we have low levels of sex hormone binding globulin. We'll have some androgens and some estrogens thus bound to sex hormone binding globulins, and there will be more androgens bound than estrogens. We will also have some androgens and estrogens that are free, but in this example, I've shown equal amounts of free androgens and estrogens. Now imagine that we move to a scenario where we have a high level of sex hormone binding globulins. We will therefore bind more androgens and estrogens. However, relatively more androgens will get pulled from the free compartment than estrogens. This means what's left behind in the free compartment will be a relative excess of estrogens to androgens. In other words, we no longer have the equal amounts that I showed in the prior example. We now have a greater ratio of free estrogens to androgens, and thus we have amplification of the effects of estrogens in the setting of high sex hormone binding globulins. You can see these effects clinically in a number of situations. You can have an increase in the amount of sex hormone binding globulins if you administer exogenous estrogens, for example, in women who are taking oral contraceptive pills. You can also see a rise in the sex hormone binding globulin level in hyperthyroidism. In both of these instances, you can see an amplification of the estrogen effects because the amount of free estrogen relative to androgen will become increased due to the rise in sex hormone binding globulins. This can potentially cause gynecomastia in men from the excess of estrogen effect. You can have a decrease in the amount of sex hormone binding globulins if you administer exogenous androgens, such as in men who take testosterone supplements. You can also see a lowering of sex hormone binding globulin levels in hypothyroidism and in nephrotic syndrome because the proteins are lost in the urine. This can potentially increase the androgen effects because when you lower the amount of sex hormone binding globulin, you increase the ratio of androgens to estrogen that are available freely to exert their effects, and this can potentially cause hirsutism in women from excess androgen effects. Another case where this plays a role is in cirrhosis. In cirrhosis, it is well described that there are increased effects of estrogens. Men can develop gynecomastia. Spider nevi and palmar erythema are two skin findings believed to result from high estrogen effects, and men can also develop testicular atrophy and impotence. In cirrhosis, there is altered metabolism and excretion of estrogens, and this leads to high estrogen levels. As we just described, estrogen can promote the production of sex hormone binding globulins from the liver. So as long as the liver retains some protein-producing capacity in cirrhosis, you will see a rise in SHBG levels, and this will lead to amplification of the estrogen effects, and thus the clinical features of high estrogens relative to androgens. Just like most endocrine systems in the body, the reproductive hormones have a three-tier level of control of their release. The highest level is the hypothalamus, which releases a hormone called gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. This stimulates the pituitary gland to produce the two gonadotropins, which are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These hormones then act on the testes and the ovaries, which secrete androgens and estrogens that feed back on the pituitary and the hypothalamus, as I've shown in this picture. The pituitary hormones FSH and LH are responsible for many of the changes seen in puberty. The levels of these two hormones are low before puberty, but they rise at puberty in boys and girls, and this stimulates the typical changes seen in puberty. Let's talk in more detail about gonadotropin-releasing hormone, or GnRH. This is a peptide produced by the hypothalamus. It's a peptide, so it has a very different structure from the steroid hormones we were discussing earlier, and it's released in pulses. It's often described as being released in a pulsatile manner, and the frequency and the amplitude of these pulses varies, and when they change, this changes the amount of LH or FSH that is released from the pituitary. When GnRH reaches the pituitary gland, it stimulates the release of FSH and LH via a GQ protein system with an IP3 second messenger. The way these systems work is shown on the screen here. PIP2, which is phosphatidylinositol biphosphate, is found in the membrane. When the GQ protein system is activated, PIP2 is converted to IP3, which is inositol triphosphate. IP3 then stimulates the release of calcium atoms from the endoplasmic reticulum. Those atoms can interact with DAG, which is diacylglycerol, which is left behind after the PIP2 is converted into IP3. The interaction of calcium and diacylglycerol can activate protein kinase C, which then goes on to phosphorylate substrates and exert the effects of the GQ protein system. There is a drug which functions as a GnRH agonist. That drug is called leuprolide. It's derived from GnRH. There is a D amino acid which is substituted for one of the native L amino acids. This makes leuprolide resistant to degradation. It also gives it a longer half-life so that it will occupy the GnRH receptors for a prolonged period of time. It's important for you to understand that leuprolide can function as both an agonist and an antagonist of GnRH. The reason for this is that the initial binding of leuprolide to the GnRH receptor can stimulate LH and FSH release, and thus the drug can function as an agonist. However, with chronic treatment, you will see a fall in LH and FSH levels. This is because there is a downregulation of the GnRH receptors from being chronically stimulated by leuprolide. This leads to pituitary desensitization to GnRH. This can be used in women to suppress ovarian follicular growth and ovulation. This will lead to low levels of estradiol and progesterone, similar to what you see in menopause. It's like a chemical induction of menopause via the drug leuprolide. There are a couple of clinical scenarios where leuprolide can be used. The first is to administer leuprolide in a pulsatile fashion. This is rarely done anymore. This is using leuprolide as an agonist. It will stimulate LH and FSH release. To do this, you have to administer leuprolide by an infusion pump. The dose varies every 90 minutes, and it's used to create an LH surge for ovulation in infertility. We now have better ways to treat infertility, and thus this pulsatile administration of leuprolide, which is very cumbersome, is rarely done anymore. The other way to use leuprolide is to administer the drug in a continuous manner for suppression of LH and FSH release. This is helpful in clinical situations where you want to lower the amount of androgens and estrogens being produced by the ovaries and testes. So for example, in women who have endometriosis or who have uterine fibroids, which are called leiomyomata, estrogens can make these two disease processes worse, so administration of leuprolide can be helpful. In men who have prostate cancer or boys with precocious puberty, testosterone levels can be harmful, so you can administer LH and FSH to lower the amount of androgens that are present. There is a rare syndrome called Kallmann syndrome where there is absence of GnRH secretion from the hypothalamus. This happens because of impaired migration of GnRH neurons from their origin in the olfactory bulb to the hypothalamus. Essentially, the hypothalamus lacks the neurons that normally produce GnRH. This almost always occurs in males. It's got a 5-to-1 ratio of males to females. And a key feature here is hypogonadism, which you would expect from the loss of GnRH, and also anosmia. And this is the thing to remember so you can recognize this syndrome in a board question. Because it involves abnormalities of the olfactory bulb, these people often cannot smell. Boys with this condition will have low GnRH levels, also low FSH and LH levels, and low testosterone levels. They will have delayed puberty and small testes. But the thing that will give this syndrome away in a board question is the description of loss of smell. Let's talk in a little more detail about the pituitary reproductive hormones LH and FSH. These are both protein hormones, just like GnRH. They have a very different structure from the steroid hormones like estrogens and androgens. And you should know that there are 4 hormones in the human body that share a very similar structure. LH, FSH, and also TSH, which is important for the thyroid gland, and HCG, which is important in pregnancy. They all share a similar structure. They are all what's known as heterodimers. The word dimer means they are 2 protein molecules linked together, and the word hetero means they are different protein molecules linked together. And they all have 2 chains, an alpha and a beta, but they all have the same alpha chain and a different beta chain. The beta chain is what determines whether the structure will be LH, FSH, TSH, or HCG. The alpha is always the same. And I've illustrated this on this slide. The common alpha subunit is combined with different beta subunits to make the various hormones. If you combine the alpha subunit with the FSH beta unit, you then get a molecule of the FSH hormone. If you combine the alpha subunit with the LH beta unit, you then get a molecule of the LH hormone. The same is true for TSH and HCG. And second messenger systems can be hard to remember, but one easy way to remember it for these hormones is that all of these hormones, when they reach their target sites, exert their effects via a cyclic AMP second messenger system. They convert AMP into cyclic AMP and then exert their clinical effects. And that concludes our module on reproductive hormones.